Welcome to Raw Conscious Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Cheney. Today's guest, we have Jay Spillers, and I'm very excited about this guest because Jay Spillers is an author, a researcher, and also an experiencer himself. So, welcome, Jay.
Yeah, my name is Jay Spillers, and I'm glad to be here. I live in Montana, by the way.
You live in Montana?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now you have done a lot of investigations and research on that which is near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, astral projecting. Of course, there's going to be a train going by when I'm on the recording.
Yeah.
Can you hear the train?
Yeah, I thought it was music at first playing in the background.
No, the train doesn't usually come by, except Amtrak is usually what goes by. It goes by at 10 o'clock, and it goes by at 6 o'clock. So that was some sort of worker train. But anyways, so you are a researcher of out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and you have created this amazing book. Let's talk about your book.
Yeah. Why don't I just tell a little bit about my story, how I got interested in the near-death experience? Because, okay, well, like when I was 9 years old in 1981, I accepted Christ and I became a born-again Christian. And then a couple years later, in 1983, I was 11, and I was watching this TV show called That's Incredible, and they had a episode on near-death experiences, and I just remember being 11 years old, and I was just sort of mesmerized by it because it's like, okay, well, we believe in heaven. I believed in heaven as a Christian, but it's like, wow, these people have actually been to heaven. And, some of them even talked about meeting Jesus. And I was just awestruck by it. And I can remember calling this Christian radio station asking about it. And there was this guy, his name was Dr. Martin, and he was like this apologetics researcher and, kind of a big wig if you're in evangelical circles. And he kind of poo-pooed it. This was back in 83. And I felt kind of dejected, so I put it on the burner for several more years, probably about 15 years. And then I got interested again because I started having doubts in my faith and things like that. So I started studying the near death experience and got really excited about it. And, as I started to look at it over the years, I started noticing all these parallels between what's in the Bible and the near death experience itself. And it was kind of interesting because it kind of like brings everything full circle and sort of puts everything in a bigger perspective, because sometimes when you're in a certain religious mindset, you see the world very small. You see a lot of truth, but you kind of see it, through a very tiny window, and you don't see like the bigger picture. And so I think it sort of gave me a larger perspective. And I kind of put it this way is that I kind of saw the near death experience, in a sense, it teaches all faiths. But coming from the Christian perspective, I saw, well, yeah, it affirms Christianity in the Bible, but it puts it in a more universal context and in a more inclusive context. It's much more universal in the sense that God works through all religions and that ultimately everybody is going to get, as we'd say, saved or will eventually find their way back to God or with God. And it's more inclusive in the sense like I don't believe there's any one true church or one true religion, but rather it's sort of that they all have truth and that God works with people in various religions and in churches. And you've probably seen this too, doing your show, is that a lot of near-death experiences have basically asked the question, is there a true church? Is there a true religion? Should I be following a particular religion? And the answer is always, the one that helps you get closest to God is the correct one. Or, it might be variations of that, like they all have truth. follow the one that, is right for you and things like that. So it's sort of like it's more of that universal picture to it, that the core message is love. Try to love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. And so that's the core. And then, so, I mean, in a sense, it really doesn't matter. It's like I can go to a Baptist church, I can go to a Catholic church, you could go to a Buddhist temple. God's there, in a very real sense in all of them, and some people don't even necessarily go to an organized religion, which is fine too. But, I think that's sort of the core teaching, and I kind of saw the bigger picture with it all as I started to research. And the book I wrote was Heaven's Truth, the parallels between the Bible and the near death experience. But, so that's kind of where I ended up.
Do you have one of the copies of your book where you can show the book with you?
Oh, I mean, I think it's downstairs or something, but it's
Okay,
on
that's okay. That's okay.
Amazon. Yeah, it's on
Okay.
Amazon. And yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so now you've had your own personal experiences where you've had out of body experiences and other similar experiences. What age were you when you started these experiences?
Well, I had two out of body experiences that I believe, because there was this thing in around 2000. I got this CD and it was supposed to like guide you through having an out of body experience. It would have like this music and then this guy was talking and I would just put it on and I put it on for several nights and I just listened to it and I put it on repeat and I just sleep and listen to it. And then there was one night where all of a sudden I was in my bed and I was like at the top of the ceiling and I was just feeling the ceiling and going like that. And it was kind of interesting because the only thing I wasn't really consciously thinking like, oh, I'm out of my body. What am I doing here? I was just kind of like focused in that moment on the ceiling and just kind of feeling it like that. So it's like my consciousness was just in one focal point. It was kind of almost like, like when you're in meditation and you're just completely focused on one point, so I can remember that. And then I think I had this thought about like flying around outside. So I can remember kind of just flying around the apartment complex I was in for a minute and then being back and then it ended. And for the longest time, I thought that experience was just a lucid dream. But then it's like a few years ago, I kind of thought, I think it was more than just a lucid dream. I think I was actually out of my body. It had this different feel to it, and I wasn't really thinking a whole lot of things. Like I said, I was just focused on, being at the ceiling. And then I can remember back, thinking back later, as I think I had a couple experiences when I was a kid where I did that too, where you just float at the ceiling. So I never really had like a very detailed or involved out of body experience. It was just sort of like floating at the top of the ceiling from my bed. And I've had a couple lucid dreams too where they were visitation dreams. Like right after my dad died in 2010, he came to me about a month later and he was sitting in this chair and we were kind of visiting and it felt real. It felt like I was awake. And he looked about like he did in his 50s, though he passed like at 73, but he looked about 20 years younger and he had the certain sweater I remember, like this purple sweater, and he was just seemed pretty happy and just kind of sitting there and things like that. And I just at some point I remembered, oh yeah, he's passed. And then I asked him, because I asked him like, well, what is it like being on the other side? Was it like being in heaven? And then he whispered in my right ear, he said, it's wonderful. And then I woke up and like I felt like a tingle go through my body. And later I found out there is such a thing as visitation dreams. They tend to be very lucid. They tend to feel very real. And at that, for most of it, I realized, okay, I'm in a dream state. It feels totally real. I know this person's passed, but they're here. And that's kind of like what that one was like. And a couple years later, just before my son was born, my grandparents on my mother's side came to me, and I was kind of like, for some reason, we were in the house that we lived in, when I was going to college, and it was in Utah, and I can remember thinking, why are they here? Because it's like they had been gone for over 30 years at that point, I think, or yeah, one was gone over 30 years, one was gone almost 30 years. And I never really had any dreams about them before. And I'm like, why are they here? And so I just kind of visited with them for a few minutes. And it was the same thing where it felt very vivid, very real. And I knew that they had passed and they were just visiting with me. And then just before it ended, they said someone was here to see you. And then like my dad was sitting there reading the paper and he pulls the paper down like that. And then I woke up. And so it was just it was kind of an amazing dream because I never even dreamed about them after their passing. That was the only time they ever, that I ever dreamed about them. But they were there and it was felt very vivid. And then there was like one other dream. Yeah, very
Oh,
real. Uh-huh.
mhm.
And then there was one dream. It
And
was
so
a
now, how
couple
old
weeks.
were you when they passed away?
Oh, my grandpa passed away in 84. I was 12. My grandma passed away in
Okay.
88, so I was 16. And that was about 2014, like maybe a couple weeks before my son was born. And I thought maybe they
Hmm.
came to visit me, just because he was coming, you know. And then this last visitation dream I had was just a couple weeks ago where my sister came to me. She'd passed in 2024 around July. So it was about literally 2 years ago. And she came to me and like I was trying to get to this mall and like, I was driving around and then I was trying to get my cell phone to work to call her and then she shows up because I'm sitting like on this couch at a mall and then like we start walking and she's got this giant flower bush she's showing and telling me about. She comes over to this table. There's like another woman sitting there and there's a couple kids over here and we're just talking for a minute and then I said to her, they told me you'd passed, you know, and because all of a sudden it hit me, yeah, she'd already passed, but she's here. And then she said my name, Jay, and then she walked behind the other side of this wall, and I was about to follow her, but I woke up. And that one felt very vivid and real too, and I woke up kind of like with the tingles and everything. So I've had like a few visitation dreams like that I remember.
So, anything else as a young child that would be just anything that would be out of the ordinary as you think about it now as an adult that you can remember?
Um, I didn't really have too much. I mean, I can remember like one time I uh, I was praying for God to send me a sign when I was little, and then the earthquake hit like 2 seconds later, and they announced it on the radio. It wasn't a real damaging one, but stuff like that. But I didn't have like a whole lot of experience. I just remember those out of body experiences, and I remember those dreams. And I kind of thought maybe if I had that out of body experience as a child, it kind of connected me to something, and maybe that's what sort of drew me further into the near death experience because, it seemed like I had a real fascination with them. For someone that's never technically had a near death experience, I seem to be more fascinated than most people with them. A lot of people are like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But for me, it was like just very fascinating to me to study them and to listen to them and things like that. And I think maybe that's kind of what drew me into them.
So now your family and growing up, did you grow up in the church or did you end up joining a church later on in life?
Oh, what's weird is when I was 9 years old, I went to a summer camp. It's for blind and low vision because I have a visual impairment. And there was an older kid that was talking to me about Christ, and I received Christ on the swings at this day camp for blind and low vision. And then, like a month later, one of my sisters moved home, not the one that I had the visitation room, but this one's still alive. She was like about 11 years older, and she'd become a Christian. We started going to this church called Calvary Chapel, and they were kind of active during the hippie times. They were part of like the Jesus movement, but this was like 1981, the early 80s. But they still kind of had that hippie vibe, and we started going there for a long time. And my parents had stopped going to church years before I was born, and they would start going back in the 90s. But so I went primarily with my sister and then by myself. And so I wasn't like I wasn't like from being born starting in church, but probably about 9 years old, I started going to a church that had kind of a hippie vibe to it, you know. But I think the thing is that I really love all those things, but it's like when I started studying the near death experience at first, like I think around 98 to 2000, I kind of loved it, but it kind of challenged some of the things too because it's like you start to notice, okay, well, when people die, there's like 90% of the people are going to heaven. So that's kind of different because it's like we always sort of got the perspective like, well, maybe they never put a percentage on it, but you kind of got the vibe like, maybe only 5 or 10% of the world's ever going to be saved. But it's like kind of flipped that to where like 90% are saved and only 5 or 10% are even having anything we call hell. So, I mean, that kind of surprised me. And there's people that had positive near death experiences that, had not necessarily been overtly Christian or said any kind of prayer to receive Jesus or anything, but yet they're having a positive near death experience. And for a while, I didn't really know how to process that. But it's like I think as I started to look at it more closely, it sort of opened up the Bible in a larger way to me. Like I started seeing the bigger picture, and I think I kind of came to understand that, when they're in the light, a lot of people are effectively having what we'd call a born again experience because they're being immersed in love and light and they're being totally transformed by the Spirit. So it's like, well, they're kind of having their born again moment right there, just like what Christ talked about, And most people probably will have it as they're passing over, I mean, ideally, we'd like to have a spiritual awakening right now, while on earth and redeem that time, but, it's okay. And I kind of understand death too to be more of a process because this is what a lot of scientists are talking about is that a lot of times when you die you don't go straight from life to death. It's like it's kind of a process, and you sort of see this with the near death experience that some of them will talk about seeing a silver cord attached to them, and so they're sort of processing over. And I think that's why most people that have a near death experience are kind of able to get back because in that sense their death hasn't been completely finalized, so they're at a point where they could get back. Now I think there might have been a few near death experiences where maybe they totally died and for whatever reason miraculously were able to come back, like because I think there was a near death experience of a guy in Russia that had died for like 3 days and came back. But most people that had near-death experience, it's like a few minutes or maybe an hour, you know. But and in my book, I kind of compared like the resurrection of Christ to a near-death experience, kind of like a very profound one because he was dead for a few days, and he was able to come back. And there's some nuanced differences, of course, but in a sense it's kind of like a near death experience where he completely died, and it says he went down into hell and basically proclaimed the truth, brought people up, and then came back to earth. So I kind of see that as like a near death experience. And it's kind of interesting too is that another part of the New Testament that's big is obviously the Apostle Paul, who wrote roughly half the New Testament. And you look at his experience that led him to Christ as first he had a encounter with Christ, who appeared brighter than the noonday sun, which was very much like a near death experience, only he hadn't died. And that forever transformed him. But then a few chapters later in the book of Acts, he was stoned at Lystra, and he says, I knew a man who was dead who was dead. Uh, he said, whether I was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. And he talks about seeing things that he couldn't speak of that were unspeakable. So it sounds like he had a near death experience after being stoned as well. So he had a spiritually transformative experience that brought him to conversion, and then he had a near death experience later. And this is the guy that wrote half of the New Testament. So you sort of looking at it from Christian perspective, New Testament, the founder, Jesus Christ, had a ultra near death experience, the resurrection, if you will. And then the guy who wrote half the New Testament had a spiritually transformative experience and a near death experience himself. So it's kind of like the whole Christian religion in that sense is kind of, tied into the near death experience, if you think about it, you know.
Yeah, so I'm definitely very familiar with Calvary Chapel, and but I wanted to hit on where you had spoken about Jesus. Have you ever heard of the Lazarus syndrome, where people
Um,
die for several hours and just miraculously come back to life? They call it the Lazarus syndrome,
I think I've heard that
or
term. I mean, it's
Lazarus
like,
phenomenon. hmm It's a medical term.
yeah.
The doctors
Hmm.
named it that. And have you watched anything with Jonathan Ashford? Does that sound like a familiar
I
name?
don't know who that is, but yeah, I mean, I think I've heard of the Lazarus syndrome, and like I was talking about,
hmm
there was that guy in Russia. I can't remember if his name was Peter or something, but he died
hmm
for 3 days. He came back. He
hmm
ended up becoming like a
hmm
Orthodox priest, and that was the one where the KGB, because he was a scientist and he was,
hmm
very intelligent. Because I think he had went to university several years before, most people would go, and then he was like on
hmm
speaking tours, and then he had this experience where the KGB essentially tried to kill him, but he survived. But he was like dead for 3 days and came back, and he had a very profound
hmm
experience. I guess that would be like the Lazarus experience.
hmm And concerning Jesus, in my own personal studies, and you can tell me if you can relate with this or not, but Hollywood has made the scenery of what Jesus went through, especially the Passion of the Christ, but they make it out to seem and look way worse than what it was. Because if you really pay attention to what's written in the Bible, Jesus, although he got weak carrying his cross, he was still able to speak to the audience. He was still able to have a conversation. So to say that he was just so horribly out of it and could not function at all, basically, is how that pretty much depicted it. And his crucifixion wasn't anything abnormal from many other crucifixions. And if you really look into the history of crucifixions, there would be men that would be on the cross for several days before they passed away. So concerning Jesus's crucifixion, he was on the cross for no more than, I believe it was like maybe 4 to 6 hours. And then he was allowed to come off the cross and be taken and bring to be prepared for some sort of burial. Well, according to what the Bible says, is Mary and whoever else shows up at the tombstone. My thought, Jesus actually probably lived. It's been a while since I've been in the Bible, I have to be honest with you. But it's not abnormal for somebody to not die. So the story of Mary and whoever showing up to his tombstone and it being empty, the chances of him actually living and probably being brought out and brought into another country, like actually living and leaving, it's at least a 50-50. It's at least 50-50 that he actually lived and that he was smuggled out of the country, basically. He had his, wounds tended to, then all of a sudden disappearing. It's like, if you really focus and allow that which is within you to start revealing to you what the Bible says, you'll notice that there's so many different directions that it goes in. The likelihood of Jesus surviving, especially since he got taken off the cross, he was not left on for days until he died. The chances of him living through what he went through are extremely high. It's extremely high that he lived and did not actually die. He might have passed out, but even with just being poked in the side with a spear, that's not going to fully kill him. The chances of him living are much higher than the chances of him dying. And because we have the Lazarus syndrome, where several hours later they come back to life. And in all the near-death experiences, there's some near-death experiences where somebody's underwater for an hour and a half, dead for at least an hour, and still come back to life. The man that I mentioned, Jonathan Ashford, he was dead for 3 hours in his bathroom and came back to life. And he felt literally all his blood coming back inside him, all his organs coming back to life. And there was no medical nothing there to save him. He came back to life after 3 hours on his own. So, I guess it could be, I'll just put it at 50-50. 50-50, Jesus didn't die. And if he did, it wasn't how they portray it. It was something similar to like the Lazarus phenomenon, where you might lose function of all your organs, but then they just come back. And more than likely, Mary didn't show up until 3 days later. He was probably already smuggled out of that cave, the moment anybody realized that he was actually still alive. And so, that's just something to think about. I've studied the entire Bible from front to back to front, more times than I can even count. I've read every single book that has been removed from the Bible multiple times. Like, there isn't anything that I haven't studied. I've personally had a connection with Jesus, with the Creator, which is the all. It's everything. It's in everything. It is everything. All creation is God. And having a relationship with Jesus the entire time, from the beginning of me studying the Bible and going through that, I was like completely connected to the other side the entire time. I was being led and guided by something that was definitely beyond me the entire time that I went through my study. And so I really believe that even though I'm saying 50-50 with Jesus actually not dying, like they said, I lean way more towards Jesus actually lived and that he was smuggled out of the country. They brought him out of the country. And so that's my own opinion. What do you think? Because you've done your own
Well,
studying as well.
well, I mean, I would probably take the Bible at face value on that because, it talks about when the Spirit went in, blood and water flowed out, which I've heard medically speaking is a sign that the person has died. But then when he was put in the tomb, they put a heavy stone over it, and they posted two Roman guards there. So if you were just in a weakened state, it'd be hard to remove the stone. And then there's also the account of the angels being there that essentially caused the soldiers to pass out or something. And so, and then when Christ would appear, he would be essentially glowing or something like that, and they weren't able to fully recognize him when he first came out. So it's like it sounds like he had a new or changed body from what he did before, and he's able to walk through walls. So, I mean, I personally would believe that he was dead, dead, and that it was a miracle that he came back, and that he did go to hell, rescued people out, and took them to heaven, during that time period, because it talks about that in scripture. But in terms of like visiting other places, I do believe that he went to other places because there's what we call the silent years between like age 13 and 29, roughly. And I think those times, I think he did go to India and some of the surrounding places, and there's legends of him going there. I think he did like study with Buddhist monks, and he studied with some of the Hindu leaders and things like that, and there's interactions. So I think Jesus learned a lot about things like Buddhism, and there's some of in his parables, there's certain similarities between his parables and Buddhist parables, so that he was able or influenced by like Buddhist teachings, because I think the Buddhist philosophy has a lot of truth in it, and I think it kind of like flowed into Christianity just a bit through Christ's own experiences. And but so there's that where he went to the area of India between 13 and 29, studied and interacted with those people. And then after the resurrection, I'm not Mormon, but I do actually believe that he went to the Americas and to like some of the Polynesian islands, and he preached there to them and showed them truth. And there's actually legends about this because I had this book. It's called He Walked the Americas by L. Taylor Hanson, and it's more of the direct legends of those people. So I think what probably happened with the Mormons, and I'm not Mormon myself, like I said, is I think the Book of Mormon, from what I've kind of heard, is that he took the Book of Mormon. There was like a fictional story that was written based on the legends that Joseph Smith got a hold of and then wrote the Book of Mormon. So it's like there's some truth to it, but it's like maybe a few points removed. Because it's like I start talking about Jesus coming to the Americas, and everybody's like, "Oh, well, you're a Mormon." I'm like, "Well, no, I'm actually not a Mormon. There's legends about it from the peoples themselves. I think that's kind of maybe a few levels removed where Joseph Smith got it from, you know." But that's just sort of my own feeling. So I think he's traveled to different parts, both pre-ministry and then post-resurrection. He went to different areas and shared the truth.
So there's so much information that I've studied in your book. Let's talk about, you don't have to tell everything, what parallels that you have. Can you give me a few examples of the parallels that you have specifically in your book that maybe just a few?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about like different experiences in the Bible that parallel like the near-death experience, like the Apostle Paul when he was stoned. I think that was a literal near-death experience. His conversion, where he saw Christ glowing like the noonday sun, was one. The Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to the mount, and they see Moses and Elijah, and they're glowing, and their clothes are like they're brighter than any person could ever wash them to be. And so I think that whole experience is very near death experience like. And then, like in the Old Testament, Moses sees God and his face is shone and bright. That I think maybe Moses may have had something similar to a near death experience. So you kind of see like these experiences recorded Old and New Testament throughout the whole Bible. And then it's like a lot of the imagery you see in the Bible, like, there's the tree of life where there's, the leaves are for the healing of the nation, talks about that in Revelation, and it'll talk about the river of life, and there's God's throne in there. And then you look at near death experiences, and it's like, well, you can find near death experiences where they're seeing all this stuff, because there's people that have seen the tree of life, there's people that have seen the river of life, there's people that have seen God's throne, there's people that have seen like different cathedrals and libraries and temples and things like that, that all kind of parallel what you see in the Bible. And I think the general imagery too, like there's animals in heaven, and there's a scripture in the Bible that talks about, seeing horses in heaven and things like that. So, the imagery is all there. And I don't know, in terms of like near death experiences, how much of it is influenced from people's understanding of the Bible itself. And then they see that, but they're both there, because it, I kind of see the Bible as the Bible supports the near death experience. The near death experience supports the Bible. So it's like, I don't really see them like, in conflict. I see them as like testimonies of the same thing, and they're kind of complementing each other, is kind of how I see it. And you know, people have seen Christ in heaven. People have seen a being of light that isn't necessarily identified. Sometimes they just see the light itself. So it's like all these imagery, because, like in the Bible, it talks about God is the light and Jesus is the light of the world. We are the light. And then, of course, we see the light there, and we're all connected to that light. We learn that from the near death experiences. So it's like everything there. Oh, and then another thing, too, besides the imagery, is that, it talks about we will give an account before God. There's sort of the judgment. And then in the near death experience, you have the life review, and the life review is essentially the judgment. And of course, we learn a little bit more from the life review because we give an account of our life, but it's basically we're the only ones judging. And that one was kind of surprising too, because from a Christian perspective, you expect God to be doing the judging, but it's really the only judgment's coming from ourselves. And I kind of came to see it as like, well, God is the judge in the sense that he's leading the procedures, but he's allowing us to illuminate it, see for ourselves what's there, because he can just shine the spotlight on it, and we're able to see what's going on and know for ourselves. It's not like God's got to tell us, oh, you did this wrong, you did that wrong. We already know it because, we know it intuitively because it's all made visible for us. So there's an accounting, but it's more for our benefit and for our spiritual growth and and enlightenment. But you kind of see that there's a judgment or a life review going on, and they're kind of taught both in the Bible and the near death experience. I think the near death experience sort of illuminates further what it's really like, you know.
Yeah, I feel the same about the near death experiences. When I went through the whole entire Bible multiple times, I'm like, my God, these people are having near death experiences, is what's happening here. And they're coming back with their stories, and they don't even know how to put it into words, and they're trying to explain it the best they possibly can. But I think they're having near death experiences, and that's what's happening here. So I absolutely agree with you that there is some sort of a parallel that happens with near-death experiences and experiences that have happened in the Bible. So So we are going to go ahead and start wrapping this up. Can you tell people one more time where they can get your book, the name of your book, and and uh and also one more thing I forgot. You're also a podcaster and you do interview those who have had near-death experiences. I can't fully remember, but what is the name of your YouTube channel?
Well, my podcast, which is on the YouTube and Spotify, is called Inspire Me with Jay. And you can find that on YouTube, or you can find it on Spotify. And then my book is Heaven's Truth: The Parallels Between the Bible and the Near-Death Experience. And it's mostly on Amazon, but I believe it's also on Barnes and Noble online that you can get it.
So Amazon and Barnes and Noble?
Yeah, it's on at least online on Barnes and Noble because I got it connected in. But yeah, it's primarily
Okay.
on Amazon, but you can get on Barnes and Noble too.
Okay. All right. Well, perfect. Jay, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm very excited that you came on and allowed me to interview you. I'm sure we'll chat a little bit more, maybe offline here and there, because I'd still love to pick your brain a little bit more. But we're going to go ahead and close out. We're hitting the limit of time right now, and I just want to thank you for coming on and giving me this opportunity to interview you, and have a wonderful rest of your day today.
Yeah, you too.